Good morning. How y'all doing? I'm doing great. Thanks. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to Reverend Michelle for the invitation, and thanks for in advance. I wasn't going to. I know my partner doesn't want any surprises, but Reverend Michelle is also agreeing to sign our marriage certificate today. So my current partner will soon be my husband, and so I'm really fortunate. Thank you, miss. So the title of the talk today is Pray the Gray Away. It's kind of a way of reclaiming this kind of, narrative that we can pray away same-sex attraction. And specifically, I wanted to talk about spirituality, religiosity, and this idea of successful aging, which we're going to talk about a bit as well. But I want to start by just saying that we have this fixation with the aging experience, right? And I think it connects well with this vulnerability, this idea of vulnerability. As we get older, our bodies change. In a youth-centric society, it can be very detrimental to our mental health. We also know there are a number of challenges that impact us physically as we age. And throughout history, we've had this fixation on the aging process. So, could you click on the... There we go. Oh. There we go. So this is a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, and it's entitled The Fountain of Youth. And if you're looking at the screen, to your left, you can see older adults literally being wheeled to the mythical fountain, dumped in, and the rejuvenating waters will revitalize them, and they come out the other side, spry and in shape, and entering a red tent, which Lord knows what happens in that red tent, right? But the idea here is that aging is something that we should be afraid of. It's something that we should reverse, something that brings a whole host of challenges with it. But I want to challenge you to reframe and rethink aging. It's a natural part of life, and it need not be this depressing, challenging period of our life. Now, a lot of research has been done on what makes for a successful aging experience. And it's led to a number of folks focusing on those, we call them super agers, centenarians, those who live to be 100 plus. And we asked the question, what is the key to the success? Does anyone know who this woman is? This is Jeanne Calment. And she's on record as being the oldest woman to have ever lived at 122 years, right? She passed away in 1997, so about 26 years ago. And she was asked, you can see her here, by the way, enjoying a cigarette and some cognac. She was asked, what is the key to successful aging? Well, you're close. What she said was smoking, drinking, and avoiding men. Right? So there you go. Right? So in actuality, what led to Jeanne Calment having such a successful aging experience was that she was born wealthy. She grew up in the bourgeois class in southern France. She also did smoke, but not until very much later in her life. Right? She did enjoy the casual drink, cognac, but she also was very socially engaged. She was very much embedded in her community. She had a strong social support system, and though that's what a lot of researchers attribute to her successful aging. That and also luck, because you can do everything right, but there's still a luck piece as well, right? So that's Jeanne Calment. So why are we so focused on aging, and why are we so fixated on those who are these super agers, those who defy expectations, living above 100 years old? Well, the reality is that aging is predictive of a lot of negative physical characteristics. We know this linked to arthritis, diabetes. It's also linked to hypertension and other types of heart disease, certain types of cancer. As we age, our lungs change, therefore increases our likelihood of developing upper and lower respiratory infections. And then, of course, what's becoming increasingly prevalent Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. There was this line that life will find a way. Well, it turns out that so will death, right? Part of the reason why Alzheimer's disease is becoming more prevalent is because we're outliving the types of disorders that killed us in the past, right? So we're living longer, and then we experience Alzheimer's toward the end. Now, one of the things that I find interesting and what made me want to go into the study of aging is, for one, we know that even though this characterizes a lot of older adults' experience, it doesn't characterize everyone's experience. There are folks who do not develop Alzheimer's, who do not develop these chronic disorders. And so the question is why? Why do we see certain people develop these disorders versus not? And not only on the individual level, why do we see certain populations not get diagnosed or suffer from these types of diseases? So this chart comes from the Alzheimer's Association, and it's a bar graph, and on the bottom we have age ranges, and it ranges from 55 to 64, and then 85 plus on the far end. And each of the bars corresponds to a different racial and ethnic group. And what we see in this bar graph across all the age ranges is that cognitive impairment, and we're talking, chronic memory loss, processing speed going down, perceptual speed going down, equilibrium balance issues going down, all the kind of pre-Alzheimer's types of things that we see among some older adults. It's concentrated amongst Black and Hispanic populations. So at all age levels, Black and Hispanic populations suffer more from chronic impairment, cognitive impairment, than their white counterparts. And what fascinated me as a sociologist is why? Why do we see these disparities across these populations, right? We know that it's not biology. We know that because race is a social construct, not a biological one. And so it comes down to why. Why do we see these patterns, right? Now, the question is it all bad? As I mentioned before, we do see a lot of these negative outcomes impacted by older adults, but it's not all bad, right? We have a number of examples, perhaps anecdotes, or even our own aging experience of individuals who, hula hooping in the park, going on a walk, speed walking, right? This man is one of the oldest marathon runners in the world, man from Japan. And then we have this woman, right? Wouldn't want to mess with her. Right? And so we do have examples of these super agers, these individuals who defy expectations, who don't develop these chronic diseases. We also know there are other positive aspects of aging, like wisdom. We know that older adults tend to gravitate toward positive things. We call it the positivity effect. Older adults' memory declines overall, but they also are more able to attend and remember positive experiences. So there's a lot that happens to the aging body and aging mind that are actually adaptive, right? So it's not all bad. And that leads to this consideration of so-called successful aging. Now, when you're thinking about successful aging, you probably have your own individual attitudes or perception of what it means to be a successful ager. What does it mean to age successfully? But researchers use a very specific definition when we refer to successful aging. And for us, we have this Venn diagram, and there are three components of successful aging. The first component is avoiding physical disease, right? Remaining healthy, right? Staving off chronic diseases. We also have maintaining cognitive function. And then lastly, remaining engaged in life, right? So here's the problem here. I have a problem with this, right? This all makes sense. It's pretty intuitive, right? We know that we should avoid disease. All you have to do is avoid disease, avoid cognitive decline, stay committed and involved in community. What's the problem? Well, some people can't, right? It wouldn't be fair to say if you don't do it, you just need to try harder, right? So I call this the pull yourself up by your bootstraps model of aging, right? It's incomplete. And it's incomplete because while it is intuitive that we can do these things, it doesn't really take into account the fact that we live in a society that either constrains or permits these choices, right? That's one of the powerful things about the sociological perspective, is it teaches us that we do have agency, we can make choices, but those choices are within a context. I'll give you an example I give my undergrads. Have you heard this before? I'm sorry, I don't know if I have any students in here. Okay, good. So the example I give is, let's say you want to go to a grocery, you're craving salad because you want to successfully age, right? So you're craving a salad. So you go to a gas station, it's the most convenient place, and you're trying to find a salad dressing. But you have limited choices because it's a gas station. You have ranch, blue cheese, and Italian dressing. So you have choice, right? You can choose between those three things, but your choice is constrained. Now let's say you have a little bit more time, so you go to the Whole Food store, and you have entire aisles full of exotic and delicious salad dressings. You have a choice there as well, but your choice is much broader. Why? Well, because the context allows for you to have more choice. So it's kind of a trivial example of the agency within constraints kind of model, but it has real life implications, right? Food deserts, for example. How do we expect people to be able to eat healthy fruits and vegetables, which we know is a great way to stave off physical and cognitive issues, if we don't have access to healthy fruits and vegetables? There are a lot of places where the only grocery store they have is a Dollar General. I don't know if you've been to a Dollar General recently, but they sell produce, but it's not produce I would want to buy, right? So it really does constrain our abilities. And so a lot of sociologists have taken issue with this successful aging model because, again, it puts too much pressure on an individual and ignores this larger social context, right, that allows us to be successful agers. One of the most important, I could call it a revelation or finding, maybe just perspective, has been, in the 20th century, has been this idea, this recognition that we have social determinants of health, right? And to be fair, this is something that existed in antiquity. Hippocrates, for example, wrote on the effects of the environment on our physical health, so it's not a new idea by any means. But in terms of how it's practiced in medicine, this is relatively recent. In the 50s and 60s, we had before the 50s and 60s, I should say, it was a biomedical model where the approaches to treating patients was very much focused on biological changes, bacteria, et cetera. And it wasn't until a shift in the 60s to this social determinants of health. And now we have it so that the federal government acknowledges and recognizes these so-called social determinants of health. And they're listed here. We have economic stability, right? We probably can agree that economic stability is very essential. There's one of the most deleterious stressors to our health is financial strain. Individuals who deal with financial strain have some of the most adverse effects to stress, right? Compared to, say, CEO. CEO might be stressed, but they're stressed for different reasons. They can outsource work to address those stressors. If you're a single mom, right, juggling 3 jobs, 2 kids, that financial stress is going to have much more of an adverse relation or impact on your health than the CEO stress, right? So economic stability. Also education, access, and quality, right? We talk about, getting access to school, but it's really important to also have quality education as well. Healthcare access and quality are also a leading social determinant of health. Neighborhood and built environment, where we live and where we grow up, impacts us, whether we have green spaces. These things matter, right? And one that I'm very interested in is the social and community context and how it influences our health. And for today, and it's actually really great timing for Reverend Michelle to send me the email inviting me to speak, because I'm starting a new project with my students that looks at the impacts of religiosity and spirituality on aging, right? And so I want to take the rest of the time to just talk about this particular social determinant of health and ask this question, which is, what role does religion and spirituality play in successful aging? Now, here's what we know. We know that religion and some of the features of religion are related to health and health behaviors. And in fact, it goes back quite a long time. Emil Durkheim, who's one of the founding fathers of sociology, wrote a study called Suicide, in which he was connecting the prevalence of Catholicism versus Protestantism at a country level to suicide rates. And since then, there's been a lot of research that looks at religiosity and its influence on health. And so talking about religiosity and aging is not so far off from that history of those findings. Now, one of the challenges when we're thinking about trying to uncover how does religiosity impact health is, well, what do we mean by religiosity, right? That's one of the challenges in social sciences. In physics, I don't want to badmouth any of the natural scientists here, but it's relatively easy to measure things, relatively easy. In sociology, we're trying to measure things like happiness, religiosity, right? Even education can be difficult to measure, especially when we're talking about quality of education. So there's a measurement challenge here. So the way that sociologists typically measure religiosity wait for it. Suspense is building. There we go. Yes. So the way we measure religiosity is, so we define it first and foremost as the extent of one's religious belief, right? So individuals who are highly religious or have high levels of religiosity would be those who are more religious, those with less or less religious. And we measure it by tapping into 3 dimensions of religiosity. We call it belonging, behavior, and belief, right? The belonging is the easiest piece. That is, do you belong to a denomination? Which faith do you belong to, right? So that's a survey question that you'll ask really easily. What is your faith? What is your denomination? And they'll sort you into that. And that's the belonging piece. Behaviors are a bit deeper, and that includes, well, how often do you attend religious service? We probably know, I certainly knew, growing up in the black church, we knew there were folks who showed up to church maybe once a month, right? They certainly weren't as religious as those who showed up to Bible study, church every week. When I was growing up, we had church all day. Did not like it, right? Did not like it, right? So attendance, how often do you pray? How often do you read the Bible, right? How often do you tithe? These would be aspects of behavior. And then lastly, the belief would be questions like, do you believe that the Bible is the literal word of God? Or whatever respective holy book, do you believe it's the word of the higher power? So this is the way we measure religiosity. And we take all of these 3 components, we add them together, and we basically create this sum, that if you have a higher number on this sum, you are more religious versus not. We can quibble with how we measure it. That's an eternal question with anything in the social sciences. Are we actually capturing what we think we're capturing with our measurements, right? So let's assume that measurement's correct. Given that, what do we find by looking at religiosity, this measure of religiosity, in a variety of different health outcomes? Well, we know from our research that religiosity is related to physical health and mortality. So those who measure or rate higher on religiosity have better physical health across a wide variety of health outcomes. They also experience less mortality. So they're less likely to die at any age than those who have less levels of religiosity. We also know that it impacts psychological well-being, with those who have higher levels of religiosity also expressing less depressive symptoms, less levels of generalized anxiety disorder. So it's protective for our mental health. And there's growing evidence that it actually will help to stave off Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. All right, this is still very new, but there is some evidence that suggests that it may be protective. Now, a couple of things that need to be unpacked here before we move on is, the first question, is it causal, right? Is it the case that religiosity causes these outcomes, or is it the case that people who are healthier are more likely to go to church, right? Or more likely to attend religious service, or more likely to be able to read the Bible, for example, read the holy book of their choice. So that's the eternal question. Now, the evidence suggests that it may actually be causal because we have really great longitudinal studies where we follow the same people over time, and we're able to actually track how often, and if there's any change in religiosity, if there's a corresponding change in physical health or mortality. And that evidence does suggest that there is a causal link between religiosity and mortality. So it's not, there always is a possibility of reverse causation, but the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that it's reverse causation. Right, so religiosity does indeed impact our health. I'm going to show you a graph that comes from a project that my students and I are working on. So remember we talked about the idea that the aging experience is not uniform across populations, right? Well, it's also the case that some of these protective factors, things like religiosity, may not operate the same for everybody. And this makes policy and recommendations very, very difficult, right? Because if you go to a doctor, a physician, if you have a policymaker implementing a policy saying, oh, we're going to implement this, well, it could be the case that that's not going to be useful for certain people in the population. So when we're looking at the protective effects of religiosity on cognitive impairment, what we actually found is that religiosity doesn't operate the same for everybody. So here is a graph that shows the relationship between religiosity and cognitive functioning, and it shows how nuanced this relationship actually is. So on the x-axis, we have the value of religiosity, where higher scores mean that you're more highly religious. And on the y-axis, right here, I don't know if you can see the light, but running up and down, we have the cognition score, cognitive ability score, right? We also have these dotted lines where the top two lines, I'm sorry it's not labeled on the graph, the top two lines are white men and white women respectively. And the bottom gray dotted line that's going upwards is black women. So what this is basically telling us is that religiosity does matter. It is protective for cognitive impairment, but only for black women. Yeah, interesting, right? Now, I have not unpacked this yet. I'm working with my students to unpack it. But one reason why we might see this is just because of the different ways in which religion operates for black and white populations. They are different, right? We can think of the differences between denominations, but also I mentioned the black church before. Has anyone been to the black church? It's different, right? It's great. I love it, right? But there's also been a long, strong link between black church and black liberation. MLK, right? And there's been a huge a connection, or pretty strong correlation between black liberation and the church. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why we see a protective effect among black women more so than their white peers. The answer is I don't know. Right? And that's the beauty of social science, is that it allows us to really delve in, and we find a result and we ask 10 more questions on why we might see a pattern that we see. Right? So I'm going to end by just talking about this idea of why is it that religion may matter. So it could be that it's religion and health behavior, right? There's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that those who are highly religious are less likely to consume alcohol. Save the communion, right? I remember when I was a kid, I was really irritated because I wasn't allowed to drink the wine. And it turns out that wine was really grape juice. So I was deceived for years, right? But so increased levels of religiosity may decrease alcohol use and also risky behaviors, right, which we know can be detrimental to one's physical or mental health. So it could be that. It could also be mastery and what we call locus of control, right? Mastery is the idea that you have the power to make changes in your life, right? And this is actually an interesting one when it comes to religion, because there are some faiths that teach that everything is in God's hands or the higher power's hands, which means that everything is preordained and there's very little that you can do really to change. It's all God's will. And so that belief could actually decrease your mastery, making it less likely that religiosity is protective of your health, right? So that's going to be an interesting one in terms of how it might play a role. We also know that coping strategies, whether people internalize behaviors or externalize behaviors, is tied to religiosity, and specifically through the process of prayer. For a number of people, they treat prayer as their therapy. I'm not saying that it's the ideal way to deal with mental health, but for some people, that is their way of coping, right? And going back to this idea of agency versus structure, sometimes it's not necessarily an individual choice to pray. It might be because they're in a particular context that makes prayer the only option. Growing up in the Black church, for example, mental health was considered a white people problem. It really was. And we still deal with that today. The stigma associated with mental health and the stigma associated with going to a mental health therapist. And then if you do make that change, if you do make that choice to overcome that stigma and go to a therapist, oftentimes you can talk to marginalized populations, they will say that their experience with therapy is not the greatest, right? Either microaggressions or just overt racism in some cases. And so that therapy may be the only thing they have, is the relationship with whoever their higher power is, right? And again, go to therapy. I say that as someone who desperately needs it. It's been rough. Social support. And this is probably the biggest contributing factor in terms of the protective effects of religion. We know through a lot of social science research, we're a social species. We like being around people. That's why isolation is cruel and unusual punishment. We love being around people, right? And so the social support that we get can be a really strong driver or mechanism by which religiosity increases our health and well-being. There was an interesting study that was done on the effects of prayer. And the setup was basically, we had individuals who were recovering from an operation. And the researchers were really clever. They wanted to investigate whether it was prayer that actually made a difference, or was it the perception that you were being prayed for that actually mattered. And what they found is that prayer did matter a bit, right? Probably because of this therapeutic coping piece that we talked about before. But what was the most significant driver of post-op recovery was knowing that you were being prayed for. So what does that tell you? Social support. Specifically, the perception of social support, right? If we receive social support, actually, that's not really good for our health either. You guys know why? Because then we feel indebted, right? So oftentimes the perception of social support is more powerful of a predictor of health than received social support. We feel guilty, we feel that we're indebted, etc. People are strange, right? We're weirdos. But it makes it interesting and fun to study. But probably the most important, even of all of these, even more important than social support, is the last one, which is meaning in life. Meaning. And there's a really strong correlation between high levels of religiosity and meaning in life. Growing up, I knew pretty early that I was told, I guess I should say, I didn't really know. I was told that I was destined for greatness, that God had plans for me, right? Man, right? But I believed it. I believed, and I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a teacher of some kind. And so my meaning in life is to be here and educate folks. And that could be a really powerful driver of wanting to stay here, stay well, and age successfully. We probably have heard stories, anecdotes of people staying alive until they could say their goodbyes to their family members. That's meaning. Your purpose is to be here until you're able to say goodbye. And there's some evidence that meaning in life can actually be a really powerful predictor of good health. So we are going to be traveling to Minneapolis, actually Wednesday, driving 6 students in a van to Minneapolis, 9 hours, not looking forward to it. That stress might deteriorate my aging process quite a bit. But we'll be presenting on a paper that looks at religiosity, mastery, and memory decline. So this research is very much ongoing. Still a lot to unpack and uncover. But what we know as of right now is that there is some evidence that religiosity does matter for better health. The question is to why, and why might it matter differently for different populations, right? So with that, I want to go on and dedicate this talk to my Duchess, Yvonne Fraser. March 30th will march her 2 years since her passing. So she's very heavy on my mind. But she was my inspiration. She is my inspiration. And no one aged more gracefully and beautifully in my mind than Duchess. So thank you so much. And to all of you, happy aging.